How are you? Good. I'm going to tell 2 stories. These are the stories of 2 women who listened to stories. And these are the effects the stories had on their lives. Story number 1. As long as she can remember, her people have been telling her stories of the God of the Israelites. And he is nothing like the pagan gods she knows. Her people say the God of the Israelites used a man with a stutter, a murderer, to demand that the Pharaoh of Egypt released his people. They say the God of the Israelites sent plagues, and all the firstborn Egyptian children died. Her people say you could hear the wails and the screams of the mothers way above the noise of the clamor of 1,000,000 Israelites turning their backs on slavery, taking the wealth of Egypt with them. There have been rumors of a cloud of dust and a pillar of fire leading the Israelites through the desert. They say that's him. That's the God of the Israelites, going ahead, guiding the way. They say the Red Sea parted at his command, and the Israelites walked on the dry sea bed, vast walls of water either side of them. It took an entire night for the nation to cross from one side of the river to the other. And when they all got there safely and the Egyptians tried to follow, God stopped holding the water back. And every Egyptian that was pursuing them drowned. For 40 years, this strange nomadic people have lived in the wilderness. They haven't built anything or farmed anything. They don't eat bread or drink wine. In all this time, 40 years, their clothes have never worn out, nor have their shoes. 40 years of walking and their shoes are still in one piece. Her people say that God has been feeding his people from heaven, that he's provided water for them from rocks, that he's been teaching them how to live. For 40 years, it's just been them and their God wandering in the wilderness. But now, this people, 3 million of them now, they want to settle. They're not wandering anymore. There are 3 million Israelites camped across the river Jordan, and they are coming for land, and not just any land. They're coming for her land, for Canaan. And they're starting with Jericho, her city, where she lives. And her people aren't telling stories anymore. Her people aren't speaking at all. Her people are afraid. So afraid that their hearts have melted like wax within them, and they are worried about the future. They know what is coming. So she's not surprised when the 2 Israelite spies turn up at her door. She's a hospitable woman. She runs an inn. It's an obvious place for them to come and mingle. But when the city soldiers knock on her door and they know the spies have been with her, she has a choice to make. Protect the spies, protect herself. Betray her people, or line up with the Israelites. And in a moment's revelation, she understands who the God of the Israelites is. And she says to the spies, "The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." She understands that this God, the God of the Israelites, is the God, greater than the gods she's been serving. And how she responds to that revelation changes her destiny forever. Story number 2, the second woman. In the end, the rumors of the king's relationship with his God, the prosperity of his kingdom, and the stories of his wisdom compel her to travel to Jerusalem to see it all for herself. And hers is no ordinary journey, accompanied by her musicians and cooks and maidservants, astrologers, courtiers, administrators, soldiers, camels. She travels 1,400 miles north, bringing with her vast quantities of spices and gold. And at the same time, she sends her navy ahead of her with ships laden with wood and precious stones. She can, after all, afford it. She is, after all, royalty. Confident of her status, her beauty, her wealth, and her intelligence, her primary aim is to test the king with hard questions and riddles to see if he really is as wise as the rumors suggest. And she is not disappointed. He greets her enthusiastically. He is extravagant and looks after her and her attendants well. The food is sumptuous. The palace is opulent. Everywhere she looks, there is gold and silver and precious wood. She talks to the king about everything she has on her mind, and his responses are wise and insightful. Spending time with him is a delight and a learning opportunity. And seeing the palace he has built, the food on his table, the seating of the officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he makes at the temple of the Lord, she is overwhelmed. Her, a queen, she is overwhelmed by this king and the wealth of his nation. Out of that vast wealth, the king lavishes the most extraordinary gifts on her and meets every desire that she expresses. And in a moment's revelation, she understands that all this wisdom and wealth has been given to the king by his God, the God of the Israelites. Not because of the king, but because God loves Israel. Praise be to the Lord your God, she says, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness. She has a revelation. And how she responds to that revelation changes her destiny forever. We meet the first woman. Her name is Rahab in Joshua 2. And I love Rahab. She's a little bit feisty. She's an unusual character. She's an entrepreneur. She sells flax, which is a plant from which you can get seeds and linseed oil, and you can make clothes. She has an inn, possibly a brothel. She has a second income stream. In fact, she has a third. She's a prostitute. Probably a prostitute in the temple of the pagan gods, one of the pagan gods that the Canaanites worship. And Rahab, when she receives that revelation of who God is, she's bright. She understands that she needs to respond to that revelation. That it's not enough just to hear about the God of the Israelites. Now she needs to make a decision about whether or not she's going to follow him. And as she makes the decision to follow God, her life changes forever. She's so bright that she does a deal with the spies that she is hiding. She gets them to agree that she and her family will be protected from the army that's coming into Jericho. And after the army has been and gone, all kinds of things change for her. She gets integrated into Israel in a way which is quite extraordinary, because God isn't just satisfied with saving her. What he wants to do is elevate her. So she gets to marry the army, son of the army commander. She gets integrated into the Israelite nation. Not just as an ordinary person, she gets to marry into the royal family of Judah. Can you imagine? She's a prostitute. She gets to marry the son of an army commander, because that's part of God's plan for her. He's thought this through. He knows what he's doing. He's so full of grace and love and mercy, he doesn't care that she was a prostitute. In fact, he continues to mention it. We never get away from the fact that that was her background. But what he does as part of the elevation is in the New Testament, in James and the book of Hebrews, she is commended as a woman who God justifies and considers righteous because of her faith. God absolutely acknowledges her background, but he points to what he has made her, to where he has elevated her. And not only that, but when she marries, the guy's name is Salmon. Nothing fishy about that name. But Salmon and Rahab have a baby boy, and his name is Boaz. And Boaz is one of my favorite characters in the whole of the Old Testament. He's a foreshadow of Jesus. He's one of the characters that you look at and he helps you understand exactly who Jesus is. Because Boaz steps in when he doesn't have to and rescues somebody he doesn't need to. He sees a woman who has absolutely nothing, an immigrant, with no money and no status, a widow. And he rescues her and he loves her. He redeems her. He does all the things that we know Jesus does for us, rescues and loves and redeems. And then Boaz and Ruth have a son called Obed, and Obed has a son called Jesse, and Jesse has lots of sons. And one of them is a son called David. And David is the guy who's out looking after the sheep when Samuel the prophet comes along looking for someone to anoint as king of Israel. And when David is anointed, he becomes the king of all of Israel. And we continue down that family line from Rahab through David and on and on and on and on and on, and generation after generation after, and all of a sudden, who do we find? Who is in the family tree of the prostitute? Jesus. And Jesus doesn't hide that. Jesus isn't embarrassed by that. Jesus doesn't remove Rahab from his family tree. It's right there in our faces in Matthew 1. Rahab is an important part of the salvation plan of God, regardless of her background. The second woman we meet in 1 Kings 10, and she is the Queen of Sheba. And we don't know very much about her. We don't really know where she comes from. There's a suggestion that she's from Ethiopia. There's another that she's from Yemen. We know that she traveled north about 1,400 miles to meet the King of Solomon. There are lots of rumors that are not substantiated in the Bible about the relationship that she had with Solomon. And this woman gets a revelation about the God of Israel, but never seems to take that step. Doesn't seem to make it personal. She goes back to her land with lots of gifts, with lots of wisdom, lots of knowledge. Isn't it interesting that Margaret spoke about, actually, God isn't concerned with our intellectual understanding. Jesus isn't bothered about what we think. It's a heart. She goes back with lots of information, lots of wisdom, but she doesn't go back converted. She doesn't go back knowing God. And we don't hear very much more about her, other than later on in the New Testament, Jesus commends her for her search for wisdom. But he never said that she found God, ever. Two women, both have a revelation of who God is. One says, yes, I get it. I'm going to follow you. And she becomes integral to the salvation plan of all mankind. The other still gets a revelation of God, but she doesn't say yes. And she disappears back to her land and continues to rule and disappears really into obscurity. So how do these stories apply to us? What do we take away from this? First of all, I think the most important thing that we can understand is that the gospel is for everyone. Prostitute to queen, everyone in between. The gospel extends to absolutely everyone. And God is so gracious and so merciful and so loving and so kind that he doesn't care about our background. He just wants to use us. to move his kingdom purposes forward. He doesn't look at who we were. He just looks at our potential, who we are in the kingdom, who we can be for him. And I love that about God. I love the fact that the gospel is for absolutely everyone. I love that extravagant love of his. And I don't understand it. To be completely honest, it really challenges me. Because if the gospel really is for everyone, then that has to change my view of what church looks like. It means that church doesn't look like people like me all the time. It means that there are going to be people in church that really irritate me, who come from a different background, who I may not trust with the key to my front door. I might not want parking. They're parking on my driveway. I might not know how to have a conversation with them. But the gospel is for everyone. I can't just have a load of people around me who look like me and have the same priorities as me and the same lifestyle as me and use the same language as me. That's not the gospel. The gospel is for everyone, prostitute to queen, everyone in between. Ian and I went to the West Mersey Regatta yesterday, and we were sat on the wall, and ironically, we were talking about what does church look like when it welcomes everyone? And we were doing it in the context of transgender and LGBT, and we were having that conversation. When this family appeared behind us, and somehow they completely transformed, I don't know how they did it, they just changed the atmosphere in a second. Because they came with really bad language. And they were very aggressive. And they were unkind to each other. And there was a lot of shouting. And I can remember just feeling like I needed to kind of hunch over and just block all of this stuff out. And after about 20 minutes, they decided they were going to go somewhere else. And I was relieved. Because they'd taken all of that stuff with them. And then I looked at Ian, and we laughed and just shook our heads and said, oh my goodness, what have we done? Either the gospel's for everyone or it's not. I'm relieved that those people have wandered 20 minutes down the beach, and yeah, I've been having a conversation about how the church can be more inclusive. And I recognize that when I read Rahab, the story of Rahab, I have to change my view about who is welcome in my church. There's a scripture in 2 Corinthians 5, and it says, Christ's love compels us, for we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. I wasn't very compelled yesterday to reach out to this family who probably have had a trauma or something that they haven't been able to deal with, or the sorts of stuff that Sarah has already spoken about. I was not compelled to reach out to them, to my shame. And I need to change my view about who is welcome, not just into my church, because there's no chance of them getting into my church unless they're allowed into my circle first. There's no way they're going to come up the stairs and walk into a place like this unless I've sat with them on a sea wall in West Mersey watching the regatta and talked to them regardless of the language and the behavior and the aggression and all of that stuff. I was convicted yesterday. Of how wrong it is for me to be talking about the gospel being for everyone, but then turning my back on a family who probably needs it, probably needs Jesus. Not seeing them as God sees them. You see, God isn't looking at my lifestyle and letting that determine how much of a father he's going to be to me. He's not looking at your lifestyle and using the way you live to determine how much of a father he is going to be to you. He's not looking at their lifestyle. and using that to determine how much of a father he's going to be to them. God is 100% love, 100% Father. Our lifestyle doesn't change who he is and what he wants to do, and all he wants to do is just reach out and just love us. The gospel's for everyone. And I really need to get my act together and live in a way that reflects the love of God to the people I meet. The second thing I think these women tell us is the value of stories. Richard spoke about this at the 9:15 a few weeks ago. I don't know if you noticed that the stories that the two women hear are very different. And God is very clever. He's really good at bringing people alongside us who will tell us stories that work for us in our situation. So Rahab, all the stories that she has heard have been about God's power, his protection, and his provision. Why? Because the things Rahab really needs are someone who's got power, someone who'll protect her, and someone who'll provide for her. So these stories that God has lined up, and they've been being told for 40 years, probably longer than she's been born, those stories that she's heard have had that emphasis. So when she's ready, when she gets the revelation, it's a revelation based on what she needs. She needs particular knowledge. She needs something that's going to help her. And God has set it up. He's lined it up so that she gets what she needs. And she can respond to that revelation knowing that he's got power, he's going to protect her, he's going to provide for her. The Queen of Sheba doesn't need that. She doesn't need power. She's got it. She doesn't need protection. She is well protected. She doesn't need provision. She is wealthy. But what she needs as the queen of a kingdom, she needs wisdom. She needs to know how to reign. So the stories that God sends her way are all about wealth, the wealth of a nation, and they're all about wisdom. So he taps into that need. She doesn't have the same needs as Rahab. She has her needs. So he sends stories that meet her needs. My story includes a bit in my life where I left home at 15 and I lived in a bedsit right in the middle of the red light district. It was really interesting. And I didn't want to know Jesus. I was not in the least bit interested in him at all. I didn't want to. And if anybody talked to me about God as Father, I would have just walked. In fact, I did leave rooms often because my father had abandoned me and I didn't want to know that God was my Father. But God was so good. Because the one thing I didn't have was family. And so what he did was he sent me people who came alongside me who had stories of what it was like to be in a stable family. There's a verse in the Psalms that says that God puts the lonely in families, and he did that, placed me in the middle of people who knew what it was like to be family. And they told me stories about what God had done in their families, about how he'd healed them and sustained them, and he'd loved them, and he'd supported them, and he'd opened doors for them. It's all about God. It was all the stuff I needed. It was all about family. And now I'm here, all these years later, with a fantastic story about what God has done for me. And we all have those stories. We all have stories about the love of God, the mercy of God, the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God, the intervention of God, the doors that God has opened, the things that God has done. I love the equip spot because every time I hear someone stand up here and talk about their lives, what they're doing is giving glory to God, and no one can rob them of that story. No one can say it's not true because it's their story. Our stories are so powerful and so important. God uses them. Don't be surprised if you find yourself consistently drawn alongside people, and you won't, it'll feel a bit random to you, but it'll be God's doing. The people that you're drawn alongside are the ones who need to know your story, because it speaks to them in their point of need. The third thing, and we're going to finish here. Margaret and I did not swap notes. God wants us to know him, not about him. Rahab's life is transformed because she gets to know the almighty living God for herself. And the Bible doesn't tell us how she does that, but it tells us the outcome. We can see the results. We see the marriage, and we see her child, and how well he deals with the community around him and with the person who is lost and has nothing and has no status. So we see that Rahab obviously lines herself up with who God is, gets to know him, gets to know what's important to him. And then we see that coming all the way down the line, all the way to Jesus. Rahab develops a personal relationship with God. And that changes her heart, which then changes her actions. That doesn't happen with the Queen of Sheba. Doesn't have the relationship. So doesn't get the destiny. Which is probably where I want to finish, I suppose. Out of the two, would I rather be the ex-prostitute, that feisty woman who makes a decision to follow God and walks into everything he has for her? Or would I rather be the Queen of Sheba, understanding intellectually that there is this God, but never really making the connection and missing out on all the kingdom opportunities that he had for her? I'd definitely rather be Rahab. So what I thought we would do, if it's okay with you, is we're going to get the band back. And I'd just like you to, where you are, just find someone that you trust to talk to. And it's about this story thing. See, I have a feeling that in our circles, there are people that we know need to hear a story about God. They need to hear something that we know, that we've experienced about God, that has changed our hearts, that's changed our destinies. And so in your twos, someone might have to go and sit with Trish. Just two of you, name that person. The person that you have in your mind right now that you would love to tell a God story to. And then what I'd really like you to do is to pray for each other. That God will just open a door that no man can shut, that he will give you the opportunity to speak. That there'll be a moment where you share a coffee, or you pass each other a glass of water, or you're in a meeting, or you're on the train, or you're at college, or whatever it is. And you get to share your God story with that person. So what you're sharing is the name of the person that you want to share a God story with. And then you're asking the other person to pray for the opportunity. And I'd like to be really bold, you to be really bold, actually. Do it for this week. Let's have some testimonies next week of people you shared a God story with. Go.